Now that's double their per capita population back in the United States. Where blacks were a third of the crack 1st Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division and half of its reconnaissance commanders, the front lines became known as Soulville. Soul, because the blacks like to sing soul music or something. In 1967, blacks composed 20% of the combat forces, 25% of the elite troops, and up to 45% of the airborne rifle platoons. Some 20% of the Army fatalities were black, 11% of Marine fatalities were black. Now, in case you're delusional like Martin Luther King, and you think that freedom is not of interest to blacks, take it from Daniel Chappie James, Jr., a black Air Force fighter pilot stationed at Ubon, Thailand in 1967. He says, "I've fought in 3 wars, and 3 more wouldn't be too many to defend my country. I love America, and as she has weakness or ills, I'll hold her hand." That's from a black troop. So not all of them said, "Bring on communism, we hate the white man," like Dr. Martin Luther King did. While blacks have fought in all of America's wars, the blacks were segregated from whites in all armed services until President Harry S. Truman decreed a phasing out of the Jim Crow forces in 1948. So throughout World War II it was unintegrated. All black units fought for the last time in Korea. Korea was the last place there was racial segregation. In Vietnam, Uncle Sam was an equal opportunity employer. Black farm boys yearning for adventure and black city youths yearning to escape learned long before 1965 that the armed forces were more than an employer of last resort. Not just that, but a way of life and a thing to do with your entire life. In the Army, there was a greater measure of integration than could be found anywhere in civilian society. Despite the high casualties, there was little to support the charges of some black leaders that black soldiers were being used unwillingly as cannon fodder. Because past discrimination deprived them of full opportunity, fewer blacks than whites possessed the preparation and training for entrance into more highly skilled occupations, such as electronics, and thus they ended up carrying guns or pushing brooms. So, it wasn't ingrained racism. It was simply taking the soldiers and putting them where their skills allowed them to be put, and where their self-motivation and drive and knowledge and education and so on allowed them to be put. And, by and large, blacks just weren't as educated, weren't as skilled. And so they ended up being the more doing the grunt work. Now, here's a very, very shocking fact. In 1966, blacks were flunking the armed forces pre-induction mental test at a far higher rate than whites. Blacks failed it 67.5% of the time. Whites failed it 18.8% of the time. And the first-term Army re-enlistment rate for blacks was 3 times that of whites, meaning more blacks would make their way into the middle enlistment ranks and would return to Vietnam for 2nd and 3rd terms. So there were more blacks who just said, I don't want to try to make it in society, I'm going to stay in the Army, than whites. Okay? Blacks who re-enlisted were more numerous than whites who re-enlisted, in percentage. You know. But many wanted to fight for the sake of fighting, to get the extra pay hazardous duty provided. $55 a month extra for airborne. Or found life in the service. So either they wanted the extra pay or they found life in the service, even under fire. Fairer, they found the life in the service fairer than the America that they had left behind, and certainly more exciting and challenging than the boredom, defeat, and substandard life of the ghetto slum. Said Chief Warrant Officer Roberto Lugo, who was a helicopter pilot near Saigon, quote, "I just couldn't take the prejudice in Texas, so I asked to be shipped over here. I fly because I make more money, and I stay clean." Couldn't take the prejudice. Now, it was just back in the 1990s that some white rednecks at a bar tied a black person behind their truck and dragged him to death. I'm pretty sure that was in Texas in the 90s. So, can you imagine Texas in the 60s? Another black guy, David J. Travis, said, "Obviously, I would prefer to be in Alabama conducting a search and destroy operation. But I realize that an attempt is being made here to give this country self-determination just as I would like to have for all Negroes." That's a pretty healthy attitude for him to take. I wouldn't mind doing this job in Alabama, but that's not where the job needs to be done. These people, we're trying to give them freedom, and I want freedom. I sympathize with these people, and I'm here trying to give them freedom. That's a pretty good attitude to take. Medic Lawrence Joel left a broken home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina to go to Army because, as a Negro, he says, you couldn't make it really big in the world. So it's just nothing you could do. I'll just go in the Army. There's no chance to rise up. So it's not just ingrained racism of the white culture that throws blacks into the Army. It's the ingrained racism of the white culture that drives them to the Army as a respite, as a place to get away from the prejudice. It's a place to get a fair shake. Alright, go a few pages. I'm not saying there's anything good about that. That was horrible that society was that way. But enough of the idea that we were just trying to get blacks in the Army because we hated them and trying to kill them. So we'd go skip a few pages. On July 28, 1965, when President Johnson announced to the nation that he was ordering the 1st Cavalry Division to Vietnam, he said, "We will stand in Vietnam." At the same time, the President requested that Congress authorize a 340,000-man increase in all U.S. Armed Forces personnel. When Johnson spoke, Americans stationed in South Vietnam numbered 81,000. 6 months later, American forces totaled 250,000, and within 2 years that figure nearly doubled to almost 500,000. You know, the military probably got its bureaucracy set up and its channels through the government and stuff concretized and solidified in World War II. And so that's probably why it was the last effective war that we fought. And we probably won't fight another effective war until we can go back to the methodology we used in World War II. Skipping a little bit. Before the draft reforms of 1968 distributed the selective service burden more equally, a man who knew where he was in the social structure knew his chances. So it used to be slightly prejudiced draft. If a man didn't go to college, the draft was at his front door, so he went into the military. If he went to college but dropped out, the draft grabbed him quickly. 60% of college dropouts wound up in uniform. If he graduated from, now that's pretty high, 60% of dropouts, because you do have to pass a physical and stuff. You do have to have some basic physical fitness. So for all the dropouts, 60% of them wound up in uniform. Now my own father went into the reserves, and he spent 2 years in, and so he didn't have to, they didn't draft him. See, that's weird. By going into the reserves, you don't get drafted into the Army. I understand it, but it is a bit weird, you have to admit. If a person graduated from college but was not then deferred, he might be drafted. Some who were eligible for the draft gained additional exemption by going on to graduate or professional school. Many of those who were to be drafted decided to enlist or volunteer, often in hopes of avoiding Vietnam. But if a man didn't want to go to Vietnam, often he could avoid going. He could starve himself or take drugs and flunk the draft physical. One California draft attorney stated flatly, "Any kid with money can absolutely stay out of the Army with 100% certainty." A local prosecutor agreed. If you got the dough, you don't have to go. But most Americans believed military service was a duty, and if assigned to Vietnam, they went. Who were they? Next little section here. From 65 to 67, Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall, a veteran and chronicler of combat during World War II and the Korean War, made several trips to South Vietnam. General Marshall thought that the soldiers he saw in Vietnam